lytter til Københavns Universitets seneste forsøg på at forklare verden. Sammen undersøger vi, hvad vi ved, hvad vi ikke ved, og hvad vi diskuterer endnu. Velkommen til Verden forsøgt forklaret.
Thank you, Miriam, for being with us, for taking time. I won't use many words to introduce you, because I've asked you to do it yourself. But I will say that we will talk to an academic that is exceedingly relevant for the very pertinent discussions we have these years and these months and these days and these hours about Greenland and the rest of the world. Miriam worked, I noticed, for the International Court of Justice, the Criminal Court, whatever you call it.
The International Criminal Court.
The International Criminal Court. Miriam was born in New Zealand, studied and worked in Australia and many other places, moved here to Denmark about 11 years ago, has a family, and she took the family with her to Nuuk, where she spent 7 months working on a massive, I don't know if it's massive because I haven't seen it yet, it's not done yet, a report about the health sector in Greenland and the human rights aspects of that. She's also, as we heard, working on an inquiry, an investigation, a legal investigation with 3 other experts into the so-called contraceptives case, better known in Danish as Spiralkampagne. We'll deal with both, but I've asked Miriam to do something she dislikes intensely. Say a few words about yourself.
Sure. I will, because I've been asked, but it's not my favourite thing, especially in Denmark, where I know Jantelov applies. So yes, I was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and lived and qualified as a lawyer in Australia, and I came to Denmark to do my PhD and stayed. And actually I did live for 7 months in Greenland, but it was actually before I started working on the right to health. So I've worked on research into Indigenous people's rights in connection with Greenland for a little longer, and thanks to the Independent Research Fund Denmark, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, some grant funding to look at human rights in the overseas colonized territories of the state, which included, in this case study, Greenland and also some Pacific Islands. And that really furthered research that I've done on and off for 20 years or so, looking at human rights generally, including, to some extent, Indigenous people's rights. But my general area is human rights and also just public international law, which is how I ended up at the International Criminal Court as a visiting professional during my PhD. But perhaps I'll leave it there, and if there's curious questions, feel free to ask me afterwards.
Thanks very much. The report on human rights and health in Greenland is not done yet. It was commissioned by the Institute of Human Rights in Copenhagen. And you have been at it for some time. There's obviously limitations as to what you can say about it, since you haven't delivered it yet to the people who have actually asked for it. But I know you can tell us, why is it relevant to do a report on human rights and health in Greenland in particular?
That's a great question. Thank you. And thank you for reminding me that I've not yet delivered the report. It's on its way, I can assure you. Look, what we know about, there's a lot of research that has been done on health in Greenland, maybe not the human right to health as such, but on health. So there's a lot of researchers, especially in Kalaallit Nunaat, in Ilisimatusafik, Inuit researchers who have done, and others who have done really impressive research on health in Greenland and health for Inuit specifically. And what that revealed is both a lot of strengths that exist within the health system and among healthcare and health professionals, but also some challenges. And those challenges are pronounced. And they're quite different to the challenges that exist here in Denmark, and raise questions about, are there human rights issues here that I think are really important to address, particularly in the context of knowing that the predominance of people who live in Greenland are indigenous, are Inuit, and we know that indigenous peoples generally suffer more health inequity than majority populations of the state. And so for these reasons, it's an important consideration, I think.
And obviously now it would be, I mean, my ordinary approach to things to now ask you to identify the hell of a lot of problems that the health sector in Nuuk and the rest of Greenland suffers from. There's loads of deficiencies, but we'll get back to that. I would like you to start off spelling out for us some of the things that actually work. And the reason I ask that is because we always focus on the bad things in Greenland, the large social issues, the serious problems in Greenland. And I think we need the context here, and we have a few minutes for this conversation. So can you tell us, are there actually things that work well in the Greenlandic health sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, and it's interesting too to think about how we pose that question, right? If we think about, we always think about challenges and we always think about deficiencies. Who are we? Because, you know, if you're in Kalaalleq, I think when you talk with health researchers there's a really big group of researchers who are working towards focusing much on a strengths-based approach and have been for a long time. So actually, you know, the health researchers in Greenland are really focused on how do we build strengths? How do we build on the things that we're good at, and how do we draw on our own cultural capacities, our uniqueness, the things that are unique to us. And so, for instance, there's this great program established by Aviaya Lubert-Hauptmann, who's established the SELA program in microbiology, which includes health as one of the elements that they look at in their microbiology program, which is a completely Inuit-focused program. So it's looking at Kalaalleq, the unique microbiologies that exist in Kalaalleq, and looking at how an Inuit approach to those things and an Inuit understanding of the world connects and works together with Western science to provide a really unique microbiology program. So that's one. There's also in direct health care, there's some really interesting and innovative suicide prevention programs, for instance, that are grounded in Inuit mental health and Inuit determinants of health. And there's also researchers working on, for example, identifying the different determinants of health for Inuit and disseminating those so that health practitioners, nurses, others health professionals can draw on them. So there's a lot of work being done there.
I agree with you that it's really important also to understand the developments that are positive, that are working, because otherwise it becomes difficult to understand and contextualize the problematic issues, the things that don't work. In 2023, I think it was, a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples visited Greenland and wrote a report on all the deficiencies. And he mentions, he writes, Greenland society still faces numerous challenges that relate to poverty and the lack of adequate housing, appropriate quality education, and scarce mental health support. He notes that 20% of the children in Greenland are estimated to have been exposed to violence and sexual abuse, and that Greenland has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Those deficiencies are well known to many people in Denmark. It's always talked about. It's also talked a lot about in Greenland, as you know. But this special rapporteur did not point to any problems in the provision of general health care. What did he miss? What are the actual concrete problems that justifies a human rights analysis into the provision of health services in Greenland? What are the real problems?
So that's a great question for two reasons. One is about the way that that report is written and the way that special rapporteurs write their reports. And the other is, what does the right to health actually mean?
But can you tell us what are really driving at that? I'll let you get back to that. What are the problems, the real problems on the ground? If you're sick and you live in Greenland, what happens? Where's the problem?
Yeah, so two things. One is that the right to health that I'm working on is not just about healthcare. So it's about the broader idea of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which is about a lot more than healthcare. But in the Special Rapporteur's report, to get directly to the question you want me to answer instead of going like a lecturer in my own direction, So the Special Rapporteur's report did actually identify a number of things that, in my view, are about clinical health issues. So, for instance, the report points out that there is no child psychiatry. The report points out that there's a lack of adequate care for mothers, maternal care, a lack of care in some contexts for children. There's a lack of adequate medical services. Also for people with disabilities in particular, there's a whole section on persons with disabilities not having adequate access to facilities and care that they require. So I would say that Special Rapporteur does actually point to systemic deficiencies in the health system itself, but also to a number of issues that affect the determinants of health, all of which are interrelated.
And if you were to point out, for instance, that the average person in Kalaallit lives 10 fewer years than other Danish citizens. I say other Danish citizens because people in Greenland are Danish citizens. There are problems with cancer treatment that we don't face in Denmark. There are serious diseases that are diagnosed later, etc. Can you add a few just to pile up the problems before we go on?
Sure, and this comes to, Sure. You're right. So men and women both live on average 10 years fewer than people on mainland Denmark. There's about 65% of the resources per person are spent on individuals in Kalaallit as compared with mainland Denmark. There are about 50% as many nurses per person there as there are available here, all of which impacts health in a very direct way. And for instance, the main hospital is in Nuuk. There are 11 health centres outside Nuuk. In a survey conducted in 2023, I think it was, they found that of those 11 other health centres in the other bygder or towns and settlements, only one of them had a permanent doctor. The others all had doctors who rotated in, 4 to 8 different doctors per year. Some of them are the same doctor who come back, but obviously this has implications for continuity of care, for building trust in healthcare systems, for all of those kinds of things that really impact health in a place where trust in healthcare is already compromised by historical colonial experiences.
And that was my next questions. I think we realize now that there are differences in healthcare in Denmark and in Greenland. The access to health is not equalized in this kingdom yet, to be very diplomatic. And I'll get back to that difference in how equality is perhaps or perhaps not. I'll pose that as a question in a little while, because I want you first to tell us exactly what you are implying here, that the colonial legacies still impacts on the healthcare sector. How does one see that?
Well, I think I have to be really careful here and just reiterate that I'm not speaking for Inuit. I'm not myself Inuit, so I'm only relaying the experiences that other people have told me. So they're the best people to ask this to. But my understanding is that where you have had, for instance, even the allegation of, so even if we haven't proven it, if there are allegations that people received contraceptives into their bodies without consent, if there is evidence that that people with disabilities have been abused in healthcare settings. If there, as recently as a few years ago, there was a child who died arguably from negligence in a healthcare setting after having her tonsils out. All these things big things will lead to distrust, but also small things will lead to distrust. So things like day-to-day assumptions. If you've been to the doctor and had an assumption that you have an alcohol problem, if you've been to the doctor and had an assumption that you must have been abused as a child, these kinds of things impact your feeling of safety and the extent to which you feel you can trust your healthcare provider to give you healthcare advice and care without judgment. And that can make it really difficult to feel comfortable attending the doctor. And we know, for instance, that children in Greenland see their primary healthcare provider much less than than children in Denmark, and yet Inuit children will be in hospital more than children in Denmark. Yeah. So all these are indications that something's amiss in the system.
And this is, I think we're getting very close to the one of the barriers that I know that you have been working with for a better implementation of the right to health in Greenland is exactly the cultural aspects of what is going on in the health sector. I'm sure you know the old joke. There's this old Inuit woman who comes to the hospital. She's very ill, and she starts speaking Greenlandic, and the doctor goes, "Oh, do you need an interpreter?" And she goes, "No, you do." And I suppose that is really still at the crux of the matter when we talk human rights.
Yeah.
Because you are looking at all this through the prism of human rights. So is there a human right to health being provided in the language you speak? Or how do we understand this?
Well, yes, is the short answer to that. So Denmark is party to a number of international conventions that define what the human right to health is. In all, there are 6. And one of those is the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, in which Article 25 provides that Denmark has an obligation to either provide directly healthcare services or to provide resources sufficient for healthcare services that should be designed and created by or in cooperation with the people themselves, in this case being Inuit, because when Denmark signed this convention, they identified Inuit as the only Indigenous people within the realm. So they've expressly said that these are Inuit that we're speaking about. And then it says that care must be provided taking into account the specific geographic, cultural, and social contexts of those people, including traditional medicines, including traditional preventive care practices, and so forth. All of that is actually a legal obligation under a binding treaty under international law. And that does include language as part of culture. So they do have a right to it, but this is an economic, social, and cultural right. So all human rights, all of them, the system since the beginning, since sort of 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are grounded in human dignity. Human dignity should underpin everything that we're doing when we're thinking about human rights. And so the question often is, what is the most dignified way to conduct myself here? How do you rid yourself free from discrimination too is the other part. So human dignity and that there's no discrimination. And those two things, there's different ways to implement that in different parts of the world, and it will look slightly different depending on which cultural context you are in and so forth.
But the interesting meeting here, the clash here, of course, is, and I'm implying that everybody knows that, but maybe not, that the majority of the doctors, the majority of the nurses by far, and by the doctors even more so, do not speak Galaslit. They don't speak Greenlandic. They don't know the ways. They are only there for a brief period of time. There are exceptions to all this. But they talk of limousine nurses. They talk of doctors who haven't even set foot in Greenland before they start operating, etc. So we have a massive culture class, even without the depth of, let's say, demands that you are now listing.
Yes, thank you. I mean, this is a really good point. So the vast majority of staff in the health sector, particularly doctors and nurses, are people who are temporarily employed, mostly come from Denmark, but also from the Philippines and some other parts of the world, most of whom might be coming up for sort of 2 or 3 months at a time, who are not spending, great lengths of time in Kalasat Nunaat. And that means that for some, and they often, not always, but come without any training or any cultural understanding or knowledge. And so despite best intentions, despite really wanting to contribute effectively, they're kind of handicapped from contributing effectively because they don't fully understand the culture into which they arrive.
And why do they go to Greenland in the first place?
Well, great question. I'm sure it's different for each person. But, there is a feeling sometimes among some staff who are permanent staff at hospital who carry what's called sometimes the cultural tax or the cultural load, which is training up the new people who arrive in what's culturally relevant here, how you conduct yourself here, how what you just did there might be a bit rude. That cultural load sits on the shoulders of the people who are already there, and they're not paid extra for that work, and yet they're doing it probably regularly as every new person comes in and goes out.
But there's nobody employed, let's say, at the hospital in Sisimiut or Ilulissat, one of the places that are lucky enough to have a hospital, because most places don't, if we just go general. There is nobody employed to say, look at what you call cultural safety, making sure that people are received by people who know what they're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think cultural safety comes up well before anybody would leave Denmark. You know, this is something that I think has to be in place, but it's super hard. I mean, so much money and resources and times goes into recruitment, think about the resources of flying people in, flying people out, getting their accommodation sorted, and then the effort of the locals that go into training them up. So, I mean, the question here is one of resources as well.
And there is nobody at the main hospitals there, as you're saying, there's nobody employed to make sure that this cultural gap is somehow bridged.
I want to be careful in saying there's nobody who does any cultural training. I don't know if there's nobody
but
at all.
It's not a mainstay.
But cultural safety is not a mainstreamed policy, and that's certainly something that I'm writing about in the report, that we don't have a mainstreamed, embedded and systematic approach to cultural safety.
And this constitutes at least a threat of systematic breach of obligatory human rights protection.
Yeah, and it can potentially lead to discrimination, right? Maybe unintentionally, you know, but discrimination doesn't require an intention to harm, right? And discrimination comes from behaviour that discriminates, or law that discriminates, or policies that discriminate in a way where one group of people are unable to enjoy their human rights to the same standard as another group of people.
Right, and just to be clear, for the actual person who is sick, ill, has an accident, or suffers from serious diseases or illness, this could lead to less qualified health service.
Yes, absolutely. It also risks all kinds of things. So one of the things that happens often is if a patient speaks only Kalaallisut and the carer speaks only Danish and there's no interpreter available, the carer might rely on someone nearby who happens to speak Kalaallisut to come in and just translate. And this risks patient privacy. I mean, this is a small place, and suddenly you have this person coming in to translate who you might know, or might know someone you know, and you haven't given consent necessarily for them to know. They're also potentially not a trained interpreter, so they might not be giving the message perfectly to the doctor. So all kinds of questions come in terms of the quality of care that you receive, really accessibility of appropriate care. All these questions come up when there isn't a system in place. And this isn't necessarily to say that Naalakkersuisut isn't doing a fantastic job with the resources it has. I mean, in many ways, it's really impressive what they're able to do.
Naalakkersuisut, of course, being the government in Greenland. Yeah, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Now, the interesting question that is also raised in the text for this particular program that we are now delivering to our audience, is there a demand or a human right saying that the citizens who happen to live in Greenland have the right to the exact same standard of health services as those of us who live in Denmark?
So first of all, human rights aren't dependent on citizenship. So human rights apply, the state has a responsibility for all people on its territory or under its effective control. So even if they weren't Danish citizens, if they're on Danish territory, Denmark as the state has responsibility. Human rights are agreed as treaty agreements between states. Kalaallisut Greenland is not a state. So at the simplest level, as being part of the Kingdom of Denmark, it's a Danish responsibility to ensure that human rights are met, including the right to non-discrimination. And if there's although there should be a difference in healthcare in Kalaallisut because we should be taking into account Inuit determinants of health, so it should be different. But the standard should be the same.
The standard should be the same.
By and large.
And the reason I ask, of course, is because Greenland, as a semi-autonomous entity within the kingdom, with certain laws applying, agreed by Parliament in Denmark, Parliament in Nuuk, took over responsibility 100% for the healthcare sector in 1992. That's a long time ago. So Greenlandic politicians have designed, ruled, and run the healthcare sector from a political point of view since 1992. They've taken over responsibility for the healthcare sector deliberately and with full cognizance of what that would imply. And they wanted to. It was prioritized. It was one of the very first, not the first, but it was amongst the high prioritized areas that they took over back in 1992. So I was assuming that the international obligations that we talk about here, they are actually weighing on the shoulders of the Greenlandic politicians, not those in Copenhagen.
I mean, the answer is both. So Naalakkersuisut took over health. This is true. But it's not a state, so you cannot use the internal law of the state to absolve yourself of international legal responsibility. This is really, basic international law stuff. So it remains a Danish responsibility. Human rights remain a Danish responsibility under international law. Now, a state can absolutely and often should delegate those responsibilities to individual, maybe governing entities within the state, especially when we're talking about an Indigenous group that lives in a separate place. It makes great sense to delegate responsibilities to that place so they can self-govern and ensure that things are in line with their own culture, traditions, understanding of the world. That's fine. However, where that governing entity is experiencing human rights violations for one reason or another, it falls back on the state, right? Human rights, when Denmark is answering in the UN, it's Denmark that has the seat at the United Nations to answer human rights questions, not Greenland. Greenland's invited along, but they don't get to sit there because they're not a state, right? So it falls back on Denmark as soon as it's a question of human rights. And when we talk about these kinds of rights, the obligation is that Denmark must take steps to the maximum of available resources to progressively realize the rights. Maximum of available resources does not mean what it sounds like it means. It doesn't mean Denmark has to throw everything at health in Kalasatnuna.
Forget the wars.
But it means when they're working out what is the maximum of available resources we should expect should be spent on these people, the questions that the UN committee will ask is, are the existing amount of resources, are they adequate and reasonable in all the circumstances? Does it seem like the government of the state has taken into account marginalised people and Indigenous peoples? Are they, diminished in any way? That comes into it.
I find this hugely interesting. As you know better, in the Self-Rule Act, that is the law that was passed by government, the majority, by far the majority of Danish politicians back in 2008. It went into force in 9 or 10, I forget. And then it was passed also by Parliament in Nuuk. So this is the basis for this relationship between Denmark and Greenland as we speak. This is really ground rules. And it says in Article 19 that Naalakkersuisut, government of Greenland, shall be subject to the obligations that arise out of agreements under public international law and other international rules which are at any time binding on the real.
Yeah, that's not a contradiction to me.
No, I realize that, but the question is, do you think that the Danish politicians put that in the law thinking that, now this all rests with the government of Greenland?
I'd like to think about it more kindly. Maybe the Danish politicians put it in to say, government of Greenland, we expect you to uphold human rights in the work that you do, so please do that. We expect you to uphold the obligations of the realm, so please do that. So it could be a very honourable inclusion, but it can only go so far. So Naalakkersuisut can take that responsibility and do its best to uphold human rights, but where there's an inability to, it remains with the Danish state to remedy.
And of course, the Danish state then is also obliged to provide the resources, as you say. That means basically money to hire doctors and nurses and run the hospitals, etc. Funding is an issue here. There is a lack of funding as it is. And does it also mean that if Naalakkersuisut prioritizes in ways that the Danish government would not agree to, the Danish government is still obliged to pay the bills?
Great question. I'm really glad you asked this, because what the report and what this arrangement has to balance is the right of self-determination that exists in Greenland, that is respected by self-governance, right? With the human rights obligations of the state. How do we balance that? You know, the idea that Denmark has final responsibility for human rights doesn't get to trounce the self-determination of Greenland. It doesn't mean that Denmark gets to come in and say, right, we're taking health back, we're going to take over. Absolutely not. What it means is that a conversation has to happen where Denmark is asking, what is it that's needed? Can you map where resources are required? There are these big inequities. Let's work together to address them. And resources are not just money. Resources are knowledge. Resources, I mean, all these things cost money to some degree, but they're also cultural competence. That might not cost a lot, but that's a resource. Cultural wealth is a resource. And as a resource and a competence, it should be recognized in employment circumstances, for instance, which isn't really the case at the moment.
It's really difficult now to find out how is the division of responsibilities in a human rights context. How is that, if you were to simplify it and say, well, from a human rights perspective, you've already explained why the final responsibility remains Danish, but the implementation of human rights is basically delegated to Naalakkersuisut and their departments and experts and so forth. So in the end, who's responsible for the deficiencies that you and others might determine from a human rights perspective?
Well, both. Naalakkersuisut needs to make sure that it's implementing its health policy and other policies with respect to human rights. And depending on the reasons for the deficiencies, Denmark may or may not need to come in. And at the moment, for instance, you know, Naalakkersuisut has said that it won't implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child into its own domestic law because it lacks the resources to meet those obligations when they are so clear about what it is that's missing. And in many circumstances, it's very obvious that resources is what is missing. Then it's arguably Denmark's responsibility to step forward.
And let's leave it there because I want to move on to the second theme of tonight, or this program at least, the very much talked about and written about the contraceptives case, as you have taught me to call it. I know it as the Spiralkampagne. I talked to a journalist very far away from Denmark yesterday, and he knew that word, Spiralkampagne. He didn't know the other one, contraceptives case, but I think we know what we're talking about. But still, just to reiterate, you are the vice chair of an expert group of 4 people, 4 experts, as it is, who have been asked by Naalakkersuisut to look at the human rights aspects of this particular phenomenon, the contraceptives case. I believe you were asked last year to do this, and you are to finalize sometime this fall. Mm-hmm. As the vice chair of an ongoing investigation, there are very strict limits to what you can say right now. And I just want to make that absolutely clear, and I find that fairly obvious. These are very controversial issues we're dealing with. They go deep into the heart of everybody who lives in Greenland. There are very, very strict legal questions involved, and there might be all sorts of consequences when your report is done and the politicians have to conclude on that. So I think we all understand the limitations to what you can say now. And I appreciate very much that you are saying anything at all. Now, you haven't said anything yet, but I'll ask a question in a minute. So thank you very much for even addressing this issue. You also wrote a little piece on your LinkedIn profile. That's where I have my material from, so thank you very much for that. I would ask you to start off by just telling us in your own words, what is this case? What happened in your understanding?
Yes, I will start, being a lawyer, with caveats. I am not speaking here on behalf of the group. And nothing that I've said about the right to health to this point should be taken as any kind of indication of what the group as a whole will decide in specific relation to the contraceptives case. The phrase contraceptives case was given in our terms of reference from Naalakkersuisut, so I think that's their preferred term, also because IUDs, intrauterine contraceptive devices, are not the only contraceptives at play. But what's the case about? So in the 1960s, there was what was described in the literature then, that's published now, a campaign or a policy of increasing the use of contraceptives among women in Greenland. And it started really in the 1960s, and by about 1970, according to publicly available published data, by 1970, 3,821 women had been fitted, women and girls, this included children, had been fitted with IUDs. That was 46% of all women aged between 15 and 49. So that was nearly half of the women in 1970 who had one fitted and still had it at that point. If you look at birth rates between 1968 and 1974, the birth rate per woman in 1968 was between 6 and 8 children per woman, and in 1974 that had fallen to between 2 and 3. So this is also why we have an aging population now, because everyone with 5, 6, 7 brothers and sisters born before 1968 is retiring, and those with only a couple of siblings are the ones left in the workforce. So that's the context. Now, in more recent years, there have been allegations from women, now older women, who explained that these were inserted into them without consent, or without informed consent, or without the consent of their parents in the case of children. So 143 women have engaged in civil litigation against the Danish state on human rights grounds, and that case is not resolved. And then there are 2 public inquiries on foot addressing this case, and I'm involved in the one that's focused on international legal obligations.
Exactly, and just one more question to clarify what we're talking about. Why are there 2 inquiries?
Well, I don't know really, but I can tell you that they do different things. So the first inquiry is 8 or 9 researchers who have been going for a couple of years, as I understand it, and they're looking into all of the history of what occurred, who was making decisions, what was going on at the time, and what was the law at the time within the realm. And I'm sure we'll consider domestic law as concerned human rights and so forth at the time. What it is not in their terms of reference is the international law that might have applied at the time. And so our terms of, nor actually broader societal impacts beyond those on the woman alone. Also the impact on her family or the community at large, which especially in the context of Indigenous peoples and Inuit specifically, who have a relational understanding of health and so forth, this is important. So our inquiry, our terms of reference, look at broader societal impacts, intergenerational trauma. We have a psychologist, part of our team, and then at human rights, and also whether international crimes might have been committed.
Thank you. And as you say, there are 143 women who have now brought a court case against the Danish state, claiming different things, but basically that they were not informed, that they had, they did not know, etc., that they were actually subject to this campaign.
Yeah, so this is all in media as well. Yes. So, you know, the filings are private, but the media has given a lot of these stories air. So that's 143. There's more than that have actually given statements to the other inquiries. So their midterm report, which is also public, is more than 200, I think, now.
Let's agree. I think most human rights, let's say, experts who have commented on this campaign have agreed that we are looking at very grave and serious human rights crimes, if we call them crimes, but at least violations. I don't want you to pass judgment on anything here, because that would probably not be comfortable for you right now. I'm just stating what I've read in the papers and what I wrote myself. But quoting other human rights experts
I'm
than
most
you.
comfortable with the we don't know
okay.
at this stage.
Let me get to the juice here. The former chairman of Naalakkersuisut, Mutebe Ede, famously stated that there is now proof that this was a genocide. And we're talking folkemord. That was the term used by him. There are other Greenlandic politicians who have used it. It is now a discussion, and you have also publicly explained that this is part of the inquiry that you are now conducting.
It is, yes.
Can you explain to us why that is so?
No, but I can explain what the definition of genocide is under international law.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The Genocide Convention, obviously agreed immediately after the Second World War, defines genocide in its second article. And genocide is committing any of the underlying acts of genocide with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an entire race, religion, nationality, or ethnicity. Among the underlying acts of genocide are the ones we're more familiar with, for example, killing. So if you're killing people with that intent, obviously to destroy, in whole or in part, an entire race, religion, ethnicity, and nationality, that constitutes genocide. But there are several other examples. For instance, serious psychological or mental suffering can constitute genocide, or intentionally causing those harms. Imposing measures intended to prevent existence, such as starvation, could also constitute genocide. And also measures to prevent births. So imposing measures to prevent births is one of the underlying acts of genocide. So you mentioned that I posted on my LinkedIn about this, and I did because one of the things that I can't say what the inquiry will uncover one way or the other. I don't know. There are a lot of things we don't know. We don't know what the other women felt. We only know the women who've come forward, what they've described. So there's a lot of things we don't know, and we might not know. But I did want to say that although we all have this, when we hear the word genocide, we think of this really particular thing. We all know what we're thinking of. But genocide, the definition in law is different than what we all kind of assume in our gut. It includes measures to prevent births. It doesn't require, for instance, a minimum number of victims to be a genocide. It just requires one of the underlying acts of genocide committed with that requisite intent. So even though we think of genocide and we think, well, there has to be thousands and thousands of people, there has to be millions, or it's not grave enough, that's not the case. That's just simply not what the definition is. And so the other thing to say is that genocide has two key aspects. The Genocide Convention applies to states. It says states must prevent and punish genocide. Prevent and punish. And in punishment, that means that states are obligated to enact legislation that creates a crime of genocide in their domestic law. Human individual people only have to avoid doing genocide, right? Don't conduct a genocide, that's a crime. But the state has an obligation to prevent, right? So when we're talking about a state obligation, state responsibility, it's to prevent and punish. An individual person who's carrying out a genocide, or who is undertaking the act and the intent of genocide, is a criminal under both international and domestic law. But there are different aspects here. They're heard in different courts. An individual person has a presumption of innocence. An individual person is facing their individual loss of liberty. The procedure of the court is different for an individual than it is for a state, which is heard before the International Court of Justice, a completely different place, right? So there's differences.
Thanks very much. And you said September. Your report is to be delivered to Naalakkersuisut in September.
Yeah, the reporting deadline is the 30th of September. The other inquiry's reporting deadline is the 1st of September.
I see. Exciting times. Thank you very much. I know that there is one more research project on your mind that you would like to talk about. It's not particularly, it's not defined as a Greenlandic project, but it does relate to it, I know, because we've spoken about it. So please, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I wanted to end like I was. It's a shame we didn't get to how human rights can build up a system, but we'll get there with this. I have another project that's got research funding that looks at notions of home. I wrote a chapter together with my very dear friend Nivika Viches in...
Sorry, Miriam, this is the first time I interrupted you.
You can.
And I don't want to...
How many minutes do I have left?
No, because you said to me, I forgot something. And I did. Yeah. I did forget something.
Sure.
So I will get back to the other one. Sorry for this, but we did discuss how human rights can help in a constructive way, not being only sort of pointing at the things that don't work, but also indicating...
Let me tie this together.
Please do.
Let me tie this together, because often we think about human rights as just things that exist in the breach. We're only interested when there's a violation. You know, is this a violation or not? Have we got a case here to say this is a violation? And I think we need to remember that human rights are really useful policy tools. They're actually something that should be, and this is part of the obligation, used to build up rather than simply wait for something to go wrong and then recognize a violation. And so this project that I have, and this is something that we talk about in Kalashat Nunat, there's so many health researchers working on strengths-based approaches to reforming the health system, to recognizing a broader set of determinants of health, to recognizing the benefits of traditional foods and food ways. The collecting and hunting of food makes you fitter and stronger and healthier and connects you with home for so many people. And so this book chapter I wrote with my friend Nivika was exactly about that. What constitutes home for Inuit? And I was writing about how the legal system, international law, only thinks about home as a place you're displaced from, say, or a place that you're insured for. Thinks about the structure, right, as something that can be damaged or lost, that's physical, a building. But that's a very Western European understanding of home. And my friend Nivika argues that in an Inuit context, home is about your capability in nature. Home is about so much more than bricks and where your things lie, right? And it was this really wonderful collaboration we had that took years to talk about, because we were coming from these really different ways of thinking, and I learned so much from her, and I'm really grateful for it. And after we wrote the book chapter, it built into a bigger project that now involves Canada, South Africa, Norway, the UK, and we have had Indigenous participants from the start co-design a project that's been funded with EU funding on home in the context of crisis, particularly the climate crisis. And how do we ensure that the peoples most affected by the climate crisis, which is often Indigenous peoples, have access to things like the Loss and Damage Fund? You know, how do we make it so that Indigenous peoples, for whom courtrooms are often a place where they're either going to lose their liberty or lose their children, how they can go through legal processes, these usually Western European legal processes, and still obtain measures to address the loss and damage that they might be experiencing. And we're actually working with a theatre company in South Africa called Amphitheatre to think about ways that creative arts can lead evidence in court. There's a South African court that actually admitted theatre as evidence. What happened was there was a theatre company worked with KwaZulu people who engaged in a call and response method where KwaZulu explained to them what losses they were facing. The theatre company developed a script, performed it, and then it's iterative until the script and performance is right. Then that's taken to court and performed in the court. So the judge has a better understanding of what that loss is without putting the people themselves through the discomfort of having to explain it in a language that's not their first, in an environment that's not the safest for them. Now, of course, was that the only evidence led in the case? Absolutely not. But was it relevant for the judge to get a better better understanding of what was at stake? Absolutely, right? So how can we think in different ways about how legal systems can recognise and understand Indigenous understandings of the world and minoritized and excluded voices? And that's what this whole project is about. And it's really just started, and I'm super excited about it. And I think it really could be relevant for Greenland as well.
Thanks. That is really exciting. Empatheater. Thank you very much. I remembered you telling me something about it. I think this is really important to know also that there are stuff you can learn out there that might help in the Greenlandic context as well.
Du har lyttet til Verden forsøgt forklaret. En udsendelse fra Københavns Universitet, udviklet med støtte fra Novo Nordisk Fonden.